a rather unusual case. It's unusual because we happen to be there. In terms of the internal history of East Timor, this was not an especially remarkable massacre in many respects. It certainly does not rank among the larger ones. There was the massacre at La Cluta, where, according to eyewitnesses, the soldiers slit open pregnant women with their machetes. After the Archbishop of East Timor denounced that massacre, Benny Murdani, who was then becoming Defense Minister of Indonesia, moved to have him removed from his post, and he succeeded in doing so. There was the massacre at Keras, in which many hundreds were killed. There are the running massacres in the internal countryside of East Timor. In this one, perhaps 200 people were massacred, but it happened to happen before our eyes. There happened to be a video cameraman there who was able to capture the people stumbling, covered with blood, into the cemetery. What this means is that the facts cannot be in dispute. Even the State Department, in talking about what has happened at this massacre, has not disputed the essential facts. They have pointed to a few claims by the Indonesians. One claim the Indonesians have made, for example, is that the soldiers were provoked because a soldier, they say, was stabbed along the route of march. Now, I happened to witness the clash along the route of march in which that stabbing allegedly took place. It didn't look to me at the time whether as if someone had been stabbed, but what was clear is that the other soldiers did not react. The march simply continued on to the cemetery. More than 40 minutes later, people were gathered outside, people were standing around quietly. Then the soldiers appeared up at once, and it was clear from the way they behaved that they had marched up with orders to commit a massacre. It was a very disciplined, orderly, cool, precise operation. The next day, General Sutrisno comes out and affirms that it was indeed an act of state. So the essential facts are not really in dispute. The only thing that is on the line now is what will the U.S. response be? For the first time in Congress, there are serious moves to cut U.S. military aid to Indonesia. 52 senators have signed a letter to President Bush calling on him to support self-determination for East Timor in the United Nations. A bipartisan group in the House, including Tony Hall, Democrat of Ohio, Frank Wolf, Republican of Virginia, Ron Makeley, Republican of Rhode Island, Tom Downey, Democrat of New York, Barney Frank, Democrat of Massachusetts, John Porter, Republican of Ohio, and various others will be moving to cut the U.S. military aid. The simple question now facing these legislators and now facing members of the American public is whether the U.S. wants to continue being an active participant, a criminal participant, in the ongoing mass murder of the East Timorese. This is not a subtle matter. This is not a difficult, agonizing matter. It is not a matter of ambiguity. It's a matter of the most simple moral choice. We happen to see it. We happen to see those people exploding in front of us in the street, running with blood, and them aiming and shooting these poor kids and older people in the back. It was unbelievable. It's indescribable. I just cannot convey to you what it was we saw. The video gives you a fraction of what happened there. It can't convey the full sense. But these were American M16s. These were your taxpayers' dollars at work. And now there's a choice in the Congress and a choice before the public. If the U.S. will continue, if the U.S. will support self-determination, free elections, free choice for the East Timorese, or whether it will continue to stand for mass murder in East Timor. It's really that simple. Thank you.
Well, there's a certain division of labor here, and I was originally going to say something about U.S. policy, but in view of Allan's and Noam Chomsky's expertise in this field, I'm going to talk about something different. And that is what, in my view, is Indonesians' policy in East Timor, something about why the massacre actually occurred, and why I think basically the game is already over. from the point of view of Jakarta. Let me begin with a story. I'm going to make this as short as I can, that some of you may be aware of, which is that last month a small, sort of looked like a Mississippi ferry boat, was chartered with Portuguese funding to sail on a mission from the north of Australia into the harbour at Dili with the express idea of laying wreaths, expressing solidarity with the people who were killed in the massacre. And on this boat, I think not more than 100 students, journalists of different countries and so forth. Basically, people who wanted to express some kind of solidarity. This is a very small boat, not armed in any way at all. Well, this boat, at first sight, seemed to throw the Indonesian government into a complete panic. The head of the Navy said, major preparations were underway. The whole Navy was going to be thrown into the effort to stop this necessary ferry boat from penetrating subversively into Indonesian waters. The police, the army, the Marines all chimed in. And rather to my astonishment, newspapers showed detailed, as it were, plans for the defense of Dili, of East Timor, against this dangerous invasion. But what's really interesting is this, that in the accounts given by the general who Allan referred to, General Theo Shafii, who's just moved in to replace the previous commander, he said that we have 3 battle lines to defend the capital of East Timor against the invasion. And the 3 battle lines, of course, first was the Indonesian Navy out there patrolling the waters with guns ready. The next battle line was slight come down, it's immigration officers and the police, and then the third one that really counted, of course, is the military. So you had a 3-line defense against this invasion, very different invasion from the one of 1975. But this had its sort of comic aspects to it. But what is very interesting is what then followed, because as the general began to talk on and on and on, he began to use a very strange kind of language, which I've never seen. I've been watching Indonesian politics for a long time, 25 years probably, and he began to use a language about what was going on in East Timor, which was really quite interesting. Because for years the Indonesian generals have been saying, well, it's all over by the shouting. There's just a few guerrillas up in the hills, just 2 or 3. They've got no guns left. It's all finished, it's all finished, it's all finished. Do you hear me? It's all finished, and so forth. And what the general now is saying is something quite extraordinary. What he is saying is that we have to be very careful, because if the boat arrives in the harbor, then there might be a muck by the masses. And it would be extremely dangerous if the masses, he always uses this word, massa, would get out of hand. We recognize that the massa are very difficult to face. It's the task of every military officer to understand how to face the massa. No explanation, of course, where these masses have come from. And this, it seems to me, is very striking, because that this very hardline officer in fact, is no longer talking the language of 3-4 people up in the hills, but is talking about masses who have to be a 3-line defense. It really has to be set up against, is in fact a backhanded recognition of what is now increasingly clear to people, I think, in the military themselves. That the gamble that was taken in 1975, that you could go in there, take over this place, kill off what was necessary in the terms of resistance, frighten the population, and then what you would do, the next step would be to fully absorb it into the country. And it's important to understand what that absorption involves. The calculation is, and it's an old calculation of occupying forces in many countries around the world, you get rid of the guys who are in power, you terrify the rest of the population, and then, because you don't want to kill everybody in the eyes, and there's no point in that, what you do, what you want to do, is to get the kids. And you won't understand Indonesian policy in East Timor unless you realize alongside the prison camps, alongside the executions, alongside the torture, alongside the genocidal populations at certain points, There is also, and this is very typical of colonialism, you find it in British, French colonialism, you do genocide and you educate. You torture and you build roads. It's a very classical policy. And in fact, what has actually happened in East Timor under Indonesian rule is that in fact a lot of roads have been built, that a lot of office buildings. Dili now is a city in 4 or 5 times the size what it was when the Indonesians invaded. Many, many, many Timorese have in fact been put in school, told to read Indonesian books, taught Indonesian languages, and then of course find that there's no jobs for them when they get out of the schooling system. Timorese kids have been sent to universities in Indonesia, in Java, just as the Dutch used to send Indonesian students to study in Holland. Indonesians have, up to a certain point, permitted the church to operate, and that has meant that the church has now about twice as many people in Timor as faithful followers of the church as it had at the time of the invasion. That is, what I'm really trying to say here is that the irony of this is that Indonesia has actually done exactly what the Dutch and the French and the British colonials did before them. Same calculations are there. And what they are finding is true. The Dutch colonized Indonesia for 300 years, brutalized it, exploited it, tortured, murdered, but they also built roads, they also constructed factories, they also began late in the game, but they definitely did, to put them in school. And of course it's precisely out of the schools, precisely out of the newspapers, precisely out of the modernization of life in the colony that the Indonesian nationalist movement emerged, which could never be turned back. It was only a matter of time before Indonesia would become an independent state. And I think what's happened in the last 10, 15 years, I have to say this frankly, that 8 or 9 years ago, 9, 10 years ago, when I used to go on talks like this, I was very pessimistic. I thought maybe the gamble might pay off, that so much deterioration, so much damage had been done to the Indian Timorese that it was finished. But now I think the evidence is clear that in fact it's the Indonesian policy that's finished. There's no way of getting this back now. They've lost the younger generation. Kids. Those are the kids who were in the demonstration. Notice that many of those children were under 17 years old, under 20 years old. If so, they don't even remember the pre-Indonesian period. Carpetbaggers coming in to a small town which was traditionally theirs. I mean, they're perfectly aware of what's going on. And that consciousness, that solidarity, can't be destroyed and can't be turned back. Last May, I think it was, the SSRC sponsored a meeting on East Timor in Washington, to which, rather to our surprise, a senior Indonesian military intelligence officer showed up. But the most interesting person at that meeting was a young man called Donanciano Gomez, a boy about 19 years old who'd actually been a leader of the organized protests to try and get in touch with the Pope when the Pope came to Dili some years ago. He'd been arrested and tortured for that. He managed to get out to Lisbon, and he'd come over to the United States. And what was extraordinary was that, without any sense of irony, Donanciano and I spoke to each other. I didn't know Portuguese. His English was very shaky. We spoke to each other happily in Indonesian. That was the language of communication between us. So the idea that you could, that the language somehow does you in, of course, isn't true at all. He was then taken off to the Washington Post offices, where he found somebody high up on, I was going to say Jason Robards' staff, but you'll get my point, who was a Portuguese speaker, and they chatted happily in Portuguese together, even though Portuguese has effectively been legally banned by the Indonesians for a long time. And the interesting thing was to watch that boy and the head of this military intelligence man, who had actually been a senior intelligence officer in Dili, and you could see who had confidence, which of the two thought the future was on his side. So I think, in spite of the grim news of this massacre, it's not the end of a long series of murders. It's the beginning of the end for Indonesian policy. There is much more concern now than there's ever been about East Timor in the outside world.